Olá, pessoal, boa tarde. Sejam muito bem-vindos e bem-vindas ao 4º Simpósio Brasileiro de Educação em Computação, EduComp 2024. Meu nome é Graziela Guarda, eu tenho a pele clara, cabelos castanhos lisos, olhos também castanhos. Estou usando uma blusa preta com viés branco. Sou professora da Faculdade de Computação e Informática da Universidade Presbiteriana Mackenzie e estou junto com os professores Ismar Frango e Rodrigo Duran na organização geral do EduComp 2024. É um prazer receber vocês no evento, que é realizado pela Sociedade Brasileira de Computação, SBC, através da Comissão Especial de Educação em Computação. O EduComp tem sido realizado anualmente, congregando pesquisadores e educadores da área de educação em computação, que atuam desde a educação básica até a pós-graduação, com o tema Os Desafios da Educação em Computação no Contexto da Popularização da Inteligência Artificial. O EduComp 2024 iniciou ontem, dia 22, com o Forlic, e segue a sua programação até o dia 26 de abril, de forma totalmente remota. Já somos mais de 200 inscritos, com a presença de todas as regiões do Brasil, e eu gostaria, neste momento, que vocês registrassem aqui no chat de que cidade e estado está nos acompanhando. Além dos inscritos, a comissão organizadora do evento também tem representantes de todas as regiões do país, mas há uma que eu quero destacar agora, que é a região sudeste, especificamente o estado de São Paulo, pois neste ano a Universidade Presbiteriana Mackenzie está sediando remotamente o EduComp. Agora, falando um pouco da coordenação geral do evento, eu gostaria de destacar que muitas mãos estão envolvidas para que o EduComp aconteça. Além do comitê de programa, coordenado pelos professores Marco Aurélio e Adão, que irão detalhar mais adiante, temos 10 comissões com diferentes frentes de atuação: articulação cultural, conexão com a educação básica, dados e programação, editoração e publicação dos anais. Aproveito para destacar que os anais das trilhas principais já estão disponíveis na plataforma Sol, então acessem o link no nosso site. Ferramental online e equipe de apoio técnico, que é uma equipe essencial para fazer acontecer um evento remoto como o nosso. Financeiro, inscrições e certificados, informo que alguns certificados já estarão disponíveis logo após a sua participação no evento, como foi o caso do pessoal do Forlic de ontem, porém alguns certificados poderão ter algum problema para serem gerados, então nós vamos prometer que todos os certificados estarão disponíveis até terça-feira da semana que vem. Equipe de promoção da inclusão e acessibilidade. Aproveito para agradecer ao Núcleo de Acessibilidade da Universidade Federal Rural de Pernambuco por ter revisado e disponibilizado os templates e o guia de orientações, e também a Unipampa por nos brindar com os intérpretes de Libras para as palestras do evento. Ressalto que o EduComp tem todo um cuidado com a inclusão desde a sua primeira edição. Equipe de publicidade e mídias sociais. Nessa frente temos uma equipe muito qualificada e talentosa da Universidade Estadual do Amazonas, que produz várias peças, dentre essas artes maravilhosas que vocês todos estão vendo nas nossas redes sociais. São eles as pessoas que interagem com vocês também nas nossas redes. E equipe de website. Bom, então são muitas pessoas engajadas, de forma voluntária, em favor da comunidade de educação e computação, e eu já antecipo os nossos agradecimentos a cada uma delas. Falando um pouco da programação do EduComp 2024, além das palestras, mesas temáticas e minicursos que já começaram hoje pela manhã, teremos também as sessões técnicas, começando agora à tarde, laboratório de ideias, o workshop de teses e dissertações na sexta-feira, e o primeiro concurso de teses e dissertações em educação em computação como novidade dessa edição. Eu destaco que esse é um evento acolhedor, no sentido de que trabalhos que estão iniciando têm seu espaço, da mesma forma que os trabalhos com um nível de maturidade maior, mais consolidados, oportunizando a participação de estudantes de graduação até a pós-graduação e os professores que desejem compartilhar suas ideias. Manteremos na edição deste ano o lançamento de livros. Essa trilha surgiu de uma demanda da própria comunidade, então na quinta, 2 livros serão lançados. A gente vai mostrar um vídeo desses livros hoje. Sobre a transmissão, algumas atividades estão sendo transmitidas ao vivo pelo YouTube do GIEC. Essas atividades ficam gravadas no nosso canal, e as outras, como sessões técnicas, laboratório de ideias, minicursos, WTD e CTD, são restritas às pessoas inscritas no evento. Então, destaca que o Laboratório de Ideias criou uma playlist com os vídeos dos trabalhos dos autores, que está disponível já no canal. Os links públicos podem ser conferidos no site do EduComp, acessando a programação, e os restritos foram enviados por e-mail aos inscritos na sexta e ontem. Porém, nós tivemos mais pessoas que se inscreveram ontem, e pode ser que nem todos tenham recebido esses e-mails a tempo. Então, se alguém se encontrar nessa situação, por favor, nos encaminhe um e-mail para que nós possamos verificar e solucionar. Tá? Então, agora eu vou mostrar rapidamente alguns dados do crescimento da nossa comunidade. Ficou invertido aqui. Então, vamos lá. Eu peguei os dados de 21/4, né, no dia anterior, e não consegui atualizar, infelizmente não deu tempo, mas até então nós tínhamos 196 inscritos, agora nós já estamos com mais de 200, então é importante destacar aqui a presença, né, bastante significativa do pessoal da região Nordeste, Sul e Sudeste, e eu me sinto muito feliz também de ver que mais de 50% dos nossos inscritos são da categoria estudantes, né, então vai dos estudantes da graduação, da educação básica e também da pós-graduação. Então, isso para a gente é muito expressivo também, assim como os professores da educação básica, que é um público-alvo, foco do nosso evento. Né? Em relação às nossas redes sociais, tivemos um crescimento, o nosso Facebook hoje está com 866 seguidores, no período de 23, 24, que foi o final do EduComp do ano passado para o EduComp desse ano, nós aumentamos um pouquinho. O nosso Instagram cresceu bastante, 311 seguidores nesse período, nós estamos com 1.039 seguidores, e aí eu chamo a atenção um pouco da equidade de gêneros, né? Nós temos uma população aqui de forma equilibrada entre os meninos e meninas. A gente sabe que a computação acaba tendo mais meninos, né? Pelas estatísticas que a gente tem até nos próprios relatórios da SBC, mas no caso do EduComp é uma área de pesquisa que acaba atraindo uma quantidade boa de pesquisadoras e estudantes meninas, né? Então, no Instagram, a gente está em maior número. Fico bastante feliz com isso. Então, falando um pouquinho só do lançamento de livros, teremos 2 livros, um livro Computação Física, Programando com Sensores e Componentes com Arduino e PictoBlocks, dos autores Almir, Andrei, Gabriel e José Anglada, da IFAM e da UEA, e o segundo livro, MC Teste, Como Criar e Corrigir Exames Parametrizados Automaticamente, do Francisco de Assis, da Universidade Federal do ABC. Tá? Então, deixa eu só parar aqui o compartilhamento. Então, dando continuidade, né, com muito prazer, então, que eu convido a professora Maria Amélia Eliseu, coordenadora de pesquisa da FCI, para compor a nossa mesa virtual. Convido também o professor Marco Aurélio Gracioto Silva, coordenador-geral do Comitê de Programa. Convido o professor Adão Caron Cambraia, coordenador-geral das trilhas formativas. E, por fim, para compor a nossa mesa de abertura, convido o professor Rodrigo Duran, coordenador da Comissão Especial de Educação em Computação. E, com isso, nós podemos dar início à nossa mesa de abertura. Desejo um excelente evento a todos.
Olá, pessoal. É a professora Maria que vai iniciar, Grazi?
Para o Marco.
Marco, se você puder iniciar.
Ok, posso começar. Então, boa tarde a todos. Meu nome é Marco Aurélio Gracioto Silva. Sou branco, homem, cabelos pretos, encaminhando-se para grisalhos, cabelos curtos, penteados para a direita. Agora estou vestindo uma camisa polo branca. Estou sentado na minha cadeira de escritório de casa, com outra mesa de trabalho aos fundos. Sou professor da Universidade Tecnológica Federal do Paraná, campus Camorão. E se por acaso vocês ouvirem alguns espirros, me perdoem, peguei um resfriado recentemente. Então, gostaria de agradecer a coordenação geral do EduComp 2024, aqui representada pela professora Graziela Guarda, pela organização desse excelente evento, e também a Universidade Presbiteriana Mackenzie, representada aqui pela professora Maria Amélia Eliseu, que cedia o evento. Também gostaria de estender meus cumprimentos aos demais colegas, o professor Rodrigo Duran, coordenador do Comitê Gestor da Comissão Especial de Educação e Computação, nossa EduComp, e também parceiro na coordenação desse simpósio. Agradeço também aos membros do comitê diretivo deste evento, a professora Ellen, a professora Mirella, o professor Whindersson e o professor Rodrigo. Os coordenadores das trilhas mais completos, também meus agradecimentos, professor Jean Hauck e Ricardo Cacefo, professores Kiev Gama e Manuel Coutinho, as professoras Ana Paula e Ana Liz, professora Rafaela da Rocha e o professor Eduardo Figueiredo, e o professor João Bersanetti e Mirella Muro, foram os coordenadores das nossas trilhas. Finalmente, mas com certeza não menos importantes, muito pelo contrário, eu agradeço imensamente também aos 125 revisores e 20 meta-revisores que contribuíram para a seleção dos artigos que serão apresentados nas sessões técnicas. Também agradeço ao professor Adão Cambraia, que é coordenador das trilhas formativas. É uma enorme satisfação contribuir como coordenador geral do programa do Simpósio Brasileiro de Educação e Computação, nosso EduComp, em sua 4ª edição. Reunida nesse evento, nossa comunidade de educação e computação, e uma crescente aumento de quantidade e qualidade, contribui para o fortalecimento e disseminação da computação em todos os níveis educacionais. Ontem, no Forlic, tivemos excelentes painéis sobre licenciatura em computação e formação de professores para a educação básica em computação. Nesta manhã, nós começamos com as vezes temáticas e minicurso, parte de nossas trilhas formativas. O professor Adão, coordenador das trilhas formativas, abordará esse tema importante no nosso evento, na fala seguinte à minha. Hoje à tarde, nós vamos ter nossa palestra de abertura, IA na Educação, e a conversa com os palestrantes Brett Becker, Paul Dani, Juho Leinonen e James Prater, responsáveis por um trabalho riquíssimo sobre inteligência artificial na educação, que é tema dessa edição do EduComp, e em especial esse trabalho com IA generative e modelos grandes de linguagem. Meus agradecimentos ao professor Rodrigo, que viabilizou essa oportunidade de interação com esse seleto grupo de pesquisadores. Após essa abertura, teremos a palestra, temos início as sessões técnicas, que tratam de uma gama ampla de temas. Concepções e organizações curriculares de ensino básico e superior em computação, pensamento computacional, formação de professores, diversidade, materiais didáticos e recursos de apoio, interação entre academia e indústria de tecnologia de informação, aspectos éticos, métodos e estratégias de ensino e aprendizagem, avaliação de aprendizagem. Todo esse conteúdo está organizado em 14 sessões técnicas que estão organizadas que organizam 40 trabalhos. 40 trabalhos que envolvem artigos de pesquisa, relatos de experiência, currículos, recursos e ambientes educacionais e ensaios. Esses trabalhos foram criteriosamente selecionados a partir de 115 trabalhos registrados, dos quais 85 foram efetivamente enviados e revisados por ao menos 3 revisores e 1 meta-revisor. Ao todo, nós fizemos 477 revisões. Novamente, obrigado a todos os membros do comitê de programa pelo fantástico trabalho. Os artigos completos, como a professora Graziela já mencionou, já estão disponíveis na íntegra e gratuitamente na SOL, a nossa biblioteca digital da SBC. Gostaria de agradecer aqui a equipe de editoração e publicação, coordenada pelo professor Wilson, pela qualidade e agilidade para disponibilizar os trabalhos. Aproveitem bem as sessões técnicas de trabalhos completos e as sessões das trilhas formativas desses próximos dias, pessoal. Depois, na sexta-feira à tarde, após a primeira edição do concurso de testes e dissertações em Educação e Computação, nós teremos a Assembleia Geral do EduComp e o encerramento do EduComp 2024. E nesse encerramento faremos as premiações dos melhores artigos e revisores. Bom evento para todas e todos. Obrigado.
Ô, Adão, você está mudo, só um instantinho.
Começando, então, questões da tecnologia, né? Então, boa tarde. Sou o professor Adão Caron Cambraia, do Instituto Federal Farroupilha, do campus Santo Augusto, Rio Grande do Sul. Sou branco, cabelos pretos, embora tenha bastante grisalhos, e aqui no vídeo eu acho que não aparece. Uso óculos, né? E no fundo tem uma estante de livros. No EduComp 2024, sou coordenador das trilhas formativas, como o professor Marco Aurélio já destacou há pouco, e as trilhas formativas têm a finalidade de potencializar a formação de novos pesquisadores na área da educação, em computação, e trazer novas discussões pertinentes ao coletivo. Como nossa comunidade é nova, nada mais justo do que potencializar por meio do laboratório de ideias, por exemplo, o compartilhamento de projetos e trabalhos em andamento, ideias novas e não testadas para estabelecer novos contatos e parcerias, conectando novos pesquisadores à comunidade. Além de estabelecer redes de contato necessárias, né, ao apresentar pesquisas de mestrado e doutorado em andamento no Brasil por meio do workshop de tese e dissertações, também possibilita aos estudantes terem um feedback sobre suas pesquisas. Nada mais importante do que ouvir sobre as pesquisas em andamento e receber sugestões de pesquisadores mais experientes. O concurso de tese e dissertações também é uma importante oportunidade para divulgar pesquisas de mestrado e doutorado já concluídas, dando uma maior visibilidade para as mesmas. A qualidade dos trabalhos pode ser evidenciada já no Esquenta 1, e agora no EduComp teremos a possibilidade de conhecer melhor esses trabalhos. Com os minicursos, a comunidade poderá conhecer e se aprofundar em relação a tópicos de interesse de educação em computação, possibilitando o trabalho prático desde o curso que foi já trabalhado. As mesas temáticas proporcionarão espaços de diálogos na comunidade e é uma trilha para dizer, para dizer o que queremos e o que precisamos falar da comunidade. Quero dizer para vocês que hoje de manhã eu participei, então, de um minicurso e de uma mesa temática muito bem organizadas e de uma excelente qualidade. Agradeço, então, aos coordenadores de trilha, das trilhas formativas, a Natália, a Sheila, o Esivaldo, o Whindersson, a Ellie, a Iorá e o Amauri. Sem eles, não conseguiríamos, né, organizar as trilhas formativas tão bem organizadas como estão. Por fim, então, as trilhas formativas estão recheadas de trabalhos inovadores e interessantes, e convido todos e todas e todes a navegar na agenda do EduComp e escolherem na programação aquelas que mais lhe interessam. Um bom evento a todos nós.
Boa tarde a todos. Eu sou Maria Amélia Eliseu, da Universidade Presbiteriana Mackenzie. Eu sou branca, cabelos e olhos castanhos. Agora eu estou usando uma camisa florida, né? Ela é bege, não, um creme com verde. Enfim, eu estou em São Paulo, atrás de mim tem um vidro com as pessoas passando, que representa muito bem a cidade de São Paulo. De vez em quando tem uns movimentos aqui atrás. Bom, antes de mais nada, eu gostaria de agradecer o professor Rodrigo Duran por ter nos convidado a sediar este evento. Foi com grande alegria que nós recebemos essa notícia e com grande prazer que aceitamos. Gostaria também de agradecer a professora Graziela Guarda, que todo o empenho, né, e dedicação organizou o evento do lado do Mackenzie para que nós pudéssemos estar presentes aqui hoje. Bom, o tema não poderia deixar de ser, né, pertinente, né? Na atualidade, muito se fala em inteligência artificial. Podemos dizer que a inteligência artificial já começa a fazer parte do dia a dia das pessoas. E discutir a inteligência artificial na educação é mais do que pertinente, até mesmo porque nós precisamos buscar caminhos para fazer da inteligência artificial uma aliada que possa auxiliar, né, e dar apoio para as questões da educação, né, principalmente na educação em computação. Então, por isso eu desejo, né, um sucesso nesse evento. Gostaria de pedir a todos que aproveitem todas as palestras, todas as sessões técnicas, porque é realmente um assunto de muito, né, de grande valor e muita pertinência nesse momento. Então, agradeço mais uma vez o nosso convite e era isso que eu tinha a dizer nessa abertura. Obrigada.
Olá, pessoal, boa tarde, tudo bem? Eu sou o professor Rodrigo Duran, eu sou branco, eu gostaria de falar que meus cabelos são castanhos, mas são totalmente brancos também, tá? Eu uso óculos com aro preto Tá, estou usando uma camiseta amarela e ao fundo, embora esteja borrado, tem uma estante com livros, tá bom? Pessoal, é uma satisfação muito grande ter todas vocês aqui, né, participando do quarto EduComp. Eu vou fazer um resgate histórico, né, agradecendo principalmente os membros que estão aqui, mas vocês já agradecendo todas as outras pessoas que fizeram isso possível. Eu vou contar um segredinho para vocês, que sempre quando a gente fala do EduComp em outros lugares, né, fala assim, nossa, vocês são muito organizados, né? E um ponto muito específico que eu gostaria de trazer e lembrar toda a comunidade, né, que nós somos voluntários, todos aqui somos voluntários, né? A gente está fazendo o evento da comunidade para a comunidade, né? E eu acho que a comunidade de educação em computação, mais do que nunca, ela nasceu desse anseio de vocês, né? Nós estamos aqui como representantes, né, da comunidade, mas foi um movimento que iniciou lá em 2018, 2019, né? Primeiro nas Jack Lives, e aí esse movimento foi crescendo até a gente ter o nosso quarto EduComp, mas sempre nasceu de um anseio de a gente estar num lugar onde as pessoas entendam o que a gente está falando, tenham os mesmos anseios, as mesmas preocupações e reivindiquem os mesmos propósitos, né? E eu acho que a gente, de certa forma, vem atendendo esse anseio, né? Nas discussões recentes que a gente teve sobre o anexo à BNCC na computação, nós estivemos ativamente participando desse processo. Ontem a gente falou um pouco sobre o POFComp, estamos ativamente participando sobre o processo, né? Nas questões mais específicas, né? Quais de artigo, etc., estamos participando desse processo, mas mais do que nunca, é trazer o que vem sendo feito, né? Trabalho de muita qualidade, como o professor Adão, o professor Marco frisou, né? Dentro da comunidade de educação e computação para o Brasil, e muito me alegra ver esse crescimento nos últimos anos, né? Tanto em qualidade quanto em quantidade, e eu tenho certeza que a gente vai ter um evento excelente, assim como foram os outros EduComps, e hoje eu também participei de todos os painéis, né? As mesas temáticas, ontem também no ForLeak, discussões interessantíssimas, e claro, né? De novo, né? É um evento para vocês, né? Feito por nós, mas para vocês, para que a gente dialogue e a gente possa crescer nessa representatividade da educação e computação no Brasil, ok? Obrigado. Grazi, você está muda.
Peraí.
Agora está certo.
Agora foi, né? Então, pessoal, agradeço a todos os participantes da mesa de abertura, né, por prestigiarem o EduComp 2024, reconhecer o trabalho que tem sido feito pela nova comissão, que startou no ano passado, que, como o Rodrigo falou, quando a gente olha para o histórico, né, se hoje nós somos uma comissão especial de educação e computação, isso vem de um trabalho que iniciou lá atrás, iniciado com um grupo de interesse em educação e computação, que foi conduzido por pessoas muito dedicadas, muito empenhadas na estruturação de tudo, né? E com isso, então, declaramos o início do nosso EduComp 2024, nós desejamos que vocês aproveitem bastante, e nós vamos passar agora uma apresentação cultural, que foi uma atividade que aconteceu na Universidade Presbiteriana Mackenzie, que foi preparada para que vocês possam assistir, porque o Mackenzie é um local onde tem muitas apresentações culturais dos mais variados temas, e a gente conseguiu eleger algumas para trazer para vocês conhecerem um pouquinho do que acontece dentro da nossa universidade. Muito obrigada a todos e bom evento a todos.
Olá, boa tarde a todas e todos. Estamos aqui para dar início ao nosso Keynote do EduComp 2024, tá? Antes de apresentar os nossos panelistas, né, que vão compor o nosso Keynote, ok? Eu vou explicar um pouquinho como é que vai ser a dinâmica dessa apresentação, tá bom? Então, nossos panelistas são o professor Brett Becker, tá? O Brett Becker, ele é professor do University College Dublin e desde 2022 ele é membro, é o vice-presidente do board da SIGSE, tá? Ele também é editor associado da ACM Transactions on Computer and Education, faz parte do comitê de programa de diversos eventos de educação e computação no exterior, né? Membros, tá? Do comitê diretivo do CompEd, né, que foi o evento global da SIGSE. Ele também é o chair do capítulo da SIGSE na Irlanda e faz parte da Sociedade para a Educação Superior na Irlanda, ok? O Brett vai ser um dos nossos keynotes. O outro keynote é o professor Paul Denny, né, ele é professor associado na Universidade de Auckland, ok? Ele tem diversos prêmios na carreira, vou ler só os mais recentes, né? Ele ganhou de melhor artigo no ACE 2022, recentemente no Technical Symposium também, 2023, na ICE 2020, TICS 2020, dentre outros, tá? Ele foi o chair entre 2021 e 2022 do capítulo da SIGSE da Australásia, né? Que é o que eles chamam lá de Austrália e Ásia, ok? Ele é membro profissional da ACM, ok? Ele também já trabalhou como comitê de programa de diversos eventos da SIGSE e atualmente ele é o chair do comitê de programa da ICER, ok? O Juho Leinonen é um pesquisador, né, na Universidade de Aalto, na Finlândia. Ele foi pós-doc na Universidade de Auckland, ok? E ele tem o doutorado dele na Universidade de Helsinki em 2019, tá? Então, o pesquisador Juho Leinonen também tiveram diversas premiações em diversas publicações, tá? Também ganharam o Best Paper em 2024 no ACE, diversos artigos aqui também premiados no Technical Symposium e na ICE, incluindo de melhor artigo, tá? E, por último, nós temos o professor James Prater, ele é professor na Abilene Christian University, tá? A formação do James Prater muito interessante, ele tem formação tanto na área de computação como na área religiosa também, bastante legal. Tinha visto isso hoje no currículo dele, tá? O professor James também, ele trabalhou em diversas dessas publicações com interesse na área de IHC e educação em computação, ok? Também dividiu esses prêmios que eu já mencionei aqui com os outros autores, e foi o melhor, ganhou o prêmio de melhor paper na SIGSE 2023, na ACE 2023, ACE 2022, ICE 2020, TICS 2020 e na SIGSE 2029, além de vários outros prêmios como educador, ok? Nesse momento, a gente já adotou a seguinte dinâmica até para oferecer um pouco mais de acessibilidade para todos os nossos membros, tá? Nós tivemos uma entrevista, né, onde eu e a professora Mirella Moro, da Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, entrevistamos os autores, tá? E a gente teve um tempo para editar o vídeo, botar a legenda, né, botar a interpretação em Libras também. Nós vamos apresentar essa entrevista que nós fizemos com os autores, tá? Enquanto a entrevista estiver sendo apresentada, vocês já podem colocar perguntas aqui no chat, tá? E também temos o link do formulário que foi enviado anteriormente. Vocês também podem enviar aqui pelo formulário, eu vou colocar aqui no chat, tá bom? Então, no decorrer da apresentação, vocês podem fazer as perguntas. Ao final dessa apresentação gravada, todos os 4 vão estar presentes aqui com a gente, tá? Para vocês fazendo perguntas diretamente a eles, ok? Nós vamos trabalhar como tradutores, se vocês assim o desejarem, ou vocês podem fazer a pergunta diretamente em inglês no chat, tudo bem? Então, vamos dar início ao nosso keynote do EduComp 2024 sobre a IA na educação em computação, ok? Até daqui a pouco. All right. So, welcome everyone to the keynote of EduComp 2024. I'm Rodrigo Duran. I'm one of the organizers of EduComp 2024, and it's a great pleasure to have you here. So, I'll introduce myself. I'm from Federal Institute of Mato Grosso do Sul in Brazil. Here with me, I have Mirella. Mirella?
Hello, guys. Hello, everybody. My name is Mirella Moro. I'm a professor at Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais. It's a great pleasure to be here with you, and welcome to EduComp, and let's have a great talk.
So, thank you very much, Mela. It's a great pleasure to have you here. I know that you are really busy, so I'm really thankful for you having time to chat with us with this topic. That is the topic of our event this year, and it's certainly a very hot topic. I have been following your citations, so I know that's hot. So please, if you could introduce yourselves. Paul, go ahead.
Hello, my name's Paul Denny. I'm an associate professor in computer science at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. And I just want to say thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. We're so excited to be able to contribute to this event. It's difficult to coordinate time zones for people around the world, and it's 6:30 in the morning here in Auckland, New Zealand. So you'll probably see that as the sun rises here in Auckland, the lighting will get a little bit better on my camera here. So anyway, thanks so much. Really excited about this, and I agree completely, Rodrigo. It's a very interesting and exciting space at the moment.
Thank you, Paul. James, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Hi, everyone. I'm James Prather, and I'm an associate professor of computer science at Abilene Christian University, and just really happy to be here on this panel with such wonderful experts, and really excited about generative AI. We've been doing a lot of research on it, and excited about all the possibilities and potentials.
Great. Thanks a lot, James, again, for being here. Juho, thanks a lot for being here.
Hi everyone, I'm Juha Leinonen and I'm an academic research fellow at Aalto University in Finland. And for the past couple of years, my main research focus has been on large language models and generative AI computing education. And I'm also very excited to be here today. As Paul mentioned, it's very early for him. For me, it's about 10 p.m. So it's great we could coordinate this even with this many time zones.
Yeah. I have to remind you to send you some Brazilian coffee to keep you that late for this participation, but thanks a lot, Juho. So let's start. So Gen AI seems to be able to do mostly everything. It's amazing your results on that you have been showing. It can create code, explain code, generate examples. What do we know exactly Gen AI can reliably do?
I think I'll start the ball rolling here anyway. I mean, one of the things you mentioned there, Rodrigo, was generating code. And at least for computing educators, I think this is one of the first things that really opens their eyes when they first see this technology, which is, wow, you can take my natural language problem descriptions that I've written from my assignments or my lab tasks, give it to these models, and it will generate working code. And I remember when we first saw this back in, I guess it was sometime in like 2021.
July 2021.
July 2021, when the OpenAI Codex model was just released as like a private beta. We just couldn't believe it. You'd give it these problem descriptions that were completely novel, you'd never used them before, and it would generate this working code. And At the time, it wasn't perfect, and we were certainly able then to, come up with problems where it would not give us a working solution. But I think to answer your question, one of the things it's doing very, very well and very reliably now is providing solutions to the kinds of small, simple programming tasks that we typically give in introductory programming courses. In fact, Juho might want to comment more here. He was part of a group that was doing some benchmarking work, taking the problems from our original paper that was looking at, how well these models solve these small CS1 type problems. And he replicated that work with a more state-of-the-art model in 2023. And I think the results were really stunning. I think we can say pretty clearly that these models reliably can solve the kinds of problems that are typical in these CS1 courses.
Yeah, so indeed, I think in that first paper that kind of really looked into this, that both Paul and James were authors of, I think it was found that Codex, which was the model used back then, was in the top quartile of students or so. So it was a very good student, and he would have passed the course and the exam. But in the replication last summer, we found that at that point, the top kind of state-of-the-art model, the kind of top model GPT-4, would solve everything except for there were a couple of problems that it had some difficulty with. And the only problem that it couldn't solve when we gave it 10 attempts to kind of try to solve it was one that was very kind of visual, using like ASCII art. So kind of something that it probably hadn't seen as much in training, but at that point it was basically would have been the best student in the class. So definitely I think it's fair to say that pretty much most of the introductory programming problems that typical computer science or kind of introductory programming courses would have can now be solved by the state-of-the-art models.
Yeah, what can it do? It can do pretty much anything that it's been trained on. And the training data is so massive and contains, a wealth of knowledge from the internet that, sites where people post their programming problems and solutions, things like Stack Overflow and Reddit and many other sites like that. And so, that also means it's not just good at solving code and code problems, but it can interpret error messages and help you find, where these should go, especially for very cryptic ones that don't return the exact line number. It's been trained on that too. And so there's a bunch of also programming adjacent things that it can do remarkably well too.
I really like that point that James raised around error messages, because for years we've known that error messages are, as James said, cryptic, difficult for students to understand, but we know they've been a real barrier for students in terms of making progress. We have observed students in our intro programming courses encounter a syntax error. Maybe they've put a brace in the wrong position or something like that. They get this really difficult, hard to understand error message, and they just can't progress. And we've seen sometimes students spending hours trying to get rid of these error messages in their code. And I think these large language models can help in two ways there, really. One is what James said, which is they can help to interpret the error message and give students a much more readable and understandable error message to help them understand what they've done wrong. But of course, the other thing is that maybe we're just not going to see that many syntax errors in the future when students are able to get assistance from these models to generate code, because the models, again, I guess this comes back to your original question, Rodrigo, which is that the models reliably generate syntactically correct code. So that's something they do very, very well. And so I think it's really interesting to see this really difficult barrier for students that has existed for decades might be something that really isn't such a problem in the future.
Yeah, we're starting to see some novel implementations of LLM tools that get at these kinds of issues students have had. I just saw a paper at SIGSI 24 from a group out of University of New South Wales in Australia, and they had implemented a tool in their course to help interpret syntax errors, and they saw just a dramatic reduction in them. So, I mean, these tools not only can do it, but they're also useful for student learning.
Okay, thank you guys. But still, there are some limitations around, right? So what are the limitations of current technologies and how those limitations impact what we do in the classroom?
So I think one of the main limitations of the models right now is, this hallucination, right? So the models can generate answers that are factually incorrect or hallucinated, and it, especially for, I think, introductory programming classes or any introductory course, I think it's a big problem if students are using generative AI and large language models, because it might be hard for them to know when the answer is actually correct and when it's kind of hallucinated. So, for example, for code help, for example, if they're using something like GitHub Copilot to help them program, they might not realize that whatever code is produced is kind of hallucinated and is incorrect, which might lead them to the wrong path in problem solving, or lead this down these debugging rabbit holes where they spend a lot of time debugging code that isn't correct because it was hallucinated.
Yeah, these models, like we just were talking about, they can do whatever they're trained on, and that's also a huge limitation because what they're trained on is stuff humans wrote, and humans have all sorts of inherent biases. Humans are racist and sexist and terrible at times. And so if it's trained on that material, then sometimes the things that the code spits out will be terrible too, right? We need to train students on these biases that are in the data sets.
I think also, I'll just add, Mirella, coming back to your question around sort of the implications in the computing classroom. Juho talked there about the fact that actually sometimes these models produce outputs that are incorrect. But even when the models generate correct outputs, so here we might be talking about correct code that solves a problem, the models don't know anything about the student. And unlike an experienced educator who can understand what types of things the student currently understands and can successfully build upon those, these models will just spit out correct code. And sometimes that code might, for example, use features or approaches that the students really have not been taught and really simply is not appropriate to show the students at that time. And I think a great example of this is something like GitHub Copilot, which is a very successful plugin to development environments like Visual Studio Code, where you can imagine an introductory programming student, someone who's a complete novice trying to learn programming. As soon as they start typing a few characters, suddenly there's this huge block of code produced. And we know that an experienced teacher or a tutor would not provide that experience to a student, right? They wouldn't suddenly say, oh, here's all of the code. So I think, again, a limitation, even when these models produce correct code, is that they're not really doing it in a pedagogically useful way.
Yeah, that's right. And when a student who sees that code, a novice, probably doesn't know the difference between code that's going to help them and code that doesn't. And so they have to stop and read it and think about it. And that can be very detrimental to their process, and actually, really detract from their learning. Whereas an expert would know to just ignore most of the things that Copilot spits out until it gets to the very moment that I need it, and then I can try and get the exact prompt I need to, help me out. But the novice doesn't have that kind of what's been termed in the literature negative experiences. They haven't had enough of those to know the difference.
Yeah, that's exactly one of the points that I want to talk with you. Now we have a new generation of students getting to our Intro CS1 classes that they know Gen AI exists. They might have this idea that it solves everything. Maybe they read your paper and say, "Ooh, that's the best student in the class. It's pretty better than me."
I want to meet that student that read my papers.
That would be great, right? But for example, how concerned we should be about this over-reliance on AI? And can you already distinguish these patterns of students using Gen AI in our classes? For example, as you mentioned, James, like we have more experienced students say, yeah, that sounds right. Might have something that I need tweaking this answer. Oh, that's completely, off the spot. And students that are truly beginners, they say, why should I trust what Gen AI is giving it to me? How can we see this pattern in students? Can we observe this pattern already?
Go ahead, you.
I was just going to say that James can add to this, but they recently actually looked into like how students are using generative AI in introductory programming courses. This is not the published paper yet, so it's on a review. Basically, one of the things we did find is that students, well, they use it, right? But they also might say that they are using it productively. So they might say that they're using it as a virtual tutor, for example. But then when we actually look at how they have been using it, they are not using it as a kind of a virtual tutor. So they might be, first, maybe in the beginning, they ask it, can you give me a hint or something? But then if they're still stuck, they might ask it for a solution. So we're kind of thinking that there might be some indications that at least for some students, it might be kind of replacing their critical thinking, right? So it might be that they are kind of getting this false illusion of competence in a way, that they kind of can solve some problems with the help of these generative AI tools, and that because they kind of still pass the tests and so on, so they might kind of the automatic tests, for example, so they might think that, well, actually I'm pretty good, I could solve that problem. But then actually, if you look at how they use the generative AI, it was mostly the generative AI doing the problem solving. But James might be able to add more on this.
Yeah, it was a really interesting study, and what we noticed, we started the study to try and find ways in which generative AI could help the students who needed help the most, the ones who would get stuck, the ones who didn't have a good plan, who needed assistance, right? Maybe AI could help them. And actually what we found was that the students who already had a good idea of what they wanted to do, a good grasp of the syntax and their problem solving, they used generative AI to just accelerate. They went fast and they solved the problem really quickly. And it was cool to watch. That's great. That's ideal. But the other half of the class struggled and struggled and struggled, and generative AI seemed to get in the way. It seemed to harm their problem solving abilities, such that most of them, almost all of them, got to the correct answer in the end. But I don't think any of them could have gotten to that answer on their own. But the way that generative AI works is such that I get pieces of information that I wouldn't have been able to solve myself over time. And I get to an answer where I have this illusion that I solved it. I finished it. But actually, I didn't do any of that. And to me, that's really, as an educator, that's scary that half of my class, like you said, had this illusion of competence.
I'll just briefly add to that I think, these kinds of tools that we've been talking about are really great for experienced developers, very much like what James said. If someone already has a very solid grasp of the fundamental concepts, then they can use these tools to accelerate their progress, using exactly the term that James mentioned. That this over-reliance issue is really a problem for students who are learning these ideas for the very first time. And because these very powerful tools are available to them, how do we encourage students to use these tools in a sort of responsible way, so they're not just totally relying on them as a crutch, sort of, as James says, to solve these problems without having to do any thinking themselves. And maybe there are some arguments for, in certain situations, non-majors, so students who are not majoring in computer science, maybe we can imagine situations where they don't need to necessarily understand all of the core concepts. But I think we would expect that a computer science major, we'd really want them to understand the core concepts. So I think we need to think about strategies for Maybe it's providing new kinds of tools that give students, better experiences, not just here are the answers, but helping guide students towards those answers and help them understand the concepts. But I think, yeah, it certainly is a challenge because students know these tools exist and they can just, click a button and get an answer. So we have to find ways of encouraging students to use the tools more reliably, responsibly, I should say.
Yes, and still in this topic, because there are shortcomings, right? AI is not perfect yet, or I'm not sure if it ever will be, but still, is there some list of good examples that we can explore with students and show them, see, this is what the AI did here, this is, I don't know, has bias, or what kind of examples, and is there a list ready for us to use, or should we start producing lists of good examples that show the students the reality of the shortcomings?
I really like the idea of having such a list, because I agree completely with you, Mirella, that it would be great to be able to show students, hey, look, these models aren't perfect. Here is the reason why you need to be able to apply, your own critical judgment skills to these outputs, because, hey, they sometimes do things like this and sometimes they do things like that. So having that kind of resource would be great. My feeling is that we have a really interesting long list of historical examples where these sorts of things have happened. I mean, even I think in a workshop we ran last year sometime, we were pretty easily able to get these models to generate outputs that clearly showed various biases that we would consider problematic. But, a year down the track, using exactly the same prompts, we simply can't replicate those problematic outputs. And so I think, yes, it's clear that you could show these historical examples, but it is getting harder and harder to come up with such a comprehensive resource. And I think it will be a real challenge to find examples that always are going to produce these incorrect or problematic outputs, just given the pace of development of these tools.
Yeah, I think that kind of well reflects the kind of that the companies that can build these models, like OpenAI, for example, Google, Microsoft, they're really working hard on, for example, trying to combat the bias in these models. So I think it's going to be still important to teach the students about it, because it's still there and it's still possible to get it to, or even get it to accidentally produce biased outputs. To kind of be able to recognize that it's a possibility, but kind of it's also nice to see that there has been good progress in combating it, and I see it a lot more now. If you try to, for example, ask the model to generate something biased, it will recognize that that would be biased and can say that, well, I refuse to generate that because it would be biased and shouldn't be generated.
Yeah, right now it's been a year since OpenAI released GPT-4, and they say actually they have GPT-5 ready, but they're working on making it safer, like Yoho said, combating these biases. And so I think they're trying to slow it down a little bit to not just make it more accurate, but also better for society, I hope.
If I can share one concrete example of this with you, Mirella, because it's a really interesting topic. One experience we had recently actually with this was generating an image, because of course these models can do a really good job of generating realistic looking images given a prompt. And so we thought it would be nice to have a picture of computer scientists enjoying coffee at a coffee break during a conference. And we were at a conference, large computing education conference, where there's this wonderful diversity of participants, from all around the world. And so, of course, we were hoping that this model would produce for us a picture of computer scientists that represents and captures this wonderful diversity of the people that make up our community. And of course, you might imagine that we had, all of these computer scientists. They were all white males, middle-aged, with glasses. They all looked exactly the same. And so this is an example relatively recently where these models are still producing outputs that really, mirror biases that or stereotypes. But as Juho said, these big companies are really trying hard to avoid these sorts of outputs. And in fact, we've seen Google remove the ability to produce images of humans because these kinds of problems were recognized. They actually tried really hard to make sure that all outputs of humans showed a lot of diversity, and it turned out that didn't work in some cases. So now they've pulled that feature. So they're trying hard, and I think it's going to be harder and harder to come up with lists of problems like the ones you described, Mirella.
Yeah,
Well,
go ahead.
I just while you were talking, I asked Midjourney, the latest model version 6 that just came out a couple weeks ago with the same prompt, computer science going a break at a conference, and yeah, they're all middle-aged white guys still.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Still there.
And like putting ourselves in the teacher's head, like I think it's kind of frightening, as you mentioned. Like last year, the first thing that I did was like to put all my assignments on ChatGPT and say, yeah, does it get it right? And it got many things wrong. And I was like, oh, great, I'm safe. And then this year, it got everything right. So I think this quest for the anti-question for ChatGPT, it might be, it's a dead race because we won't be able to beat these technologies. And that leads me to the next question about cheating, plagiarism. Like, is it the end of automated assessment as we know it? Like you mentioned that this short, usual CS1 activity that we usually give to students is already there, it has been trained. How the teachers should adapt to this new reality?
I think one of the ways to adapt is to, I think it's not completely dead, at least in my mind, is I think there's still benefit to learning those fundamental skills for students. I think certainly it might require, for example, moving or changing how we assess students. So for example, in the past, I think at least in the institution where I've been, it's been popular to, for example, give students lots of points for completing, these small programming exercises. So maybe now the way to go forward would be that we still have those exercises, but de-emphasize the grading aspect. So maybe you don't give as many course points for completing those exercises, but try to encourage students to do it just for their own kind of benefit in learning. And actually, these large language models would even help, because we've found in previous research they can actually create these small programming exercises. So we actually could have almost an infinite pool of these small programming exercises that students could kind of practice and try to learn from. So yeah, I think it more calls to change the grading practices than maybe just totally abandoning automated assessment and these small programs, because they have been found to be very beneficial for student learning in the past.
Yeah, I also take quite a positive view about these small programming tasks. So at Auckland, for example, we still use them heavily in our intro programming courses, despite the fact that for several years, me and others at the university have been concerned about the capabilities of these tools. So I agree very much with Juho that they still have a place. We know that getting students to practice sort of this drill and practice style learning is very effective, and so we don't want to remove that entirely. One thing we've done at Auckland, very much what Juho described, is slightly increase the weighting of our invigilated or secure assessments. So we still have a very large number of assessments where students are not invigilated or proctored. We have still some assessments where they are, so typically 3 or 4 tests where students don't have access to these tools. And you might argue, well, surely these tools are out there, students should have access to them. I think you can make an argument in some courses, yes, but I think in an introductory programming course, we do want students to be able to write code. That has been a skill that has been very important for a long time. And I don't think that's going to go away in our intro courses. And as long as we can send the message to students that you will need to demonstrate to us that you can construct short working programs when you don't have access to these tools, I think it helps to send a message to the students that you need to use these tools to help you learn and not over-rely on them and not just copy the inputs and paste the outputs. So yeah, very much I agree with what Juho said, that I would like to think they still have a long future ahead of them.
Yeah, this is the first semester in my course where I'm not offering any points for completing the programs. They're all still there. And instead, we have these weekly long form quizzes, and the problems on the quizzes are taken almost directly from the homework, from the programming problems. So if you did them, if you understand them, you do pretty well on the quizzes. But if you didn't bother to do them, then you don't. And so now they're a way to practice. They're a way to study for the invigilated quizzes. We'll see how it goes. I don't know.
But in your opinion, like, is it cheating to copy stuff from ChatGPT? I know that you have a take on that, James. I read some text that you wrote. How do you feel about that? I think that's the most pressing issue for teachers, is like, are they learning? And how do we actually communicate to them, like, about ethics in doing this kind of activities? How do you feel, and how do you think that students are feeling at this point?
I think my students are feeling stressed because they have these tools and they can't use them on the quizzes. So the way I've structured my course is that I've de-incentivized any sort of use of ChatGPT or Copilot that doesn't lead to their learning. So, they could ask ChatGPT to generate a solution, and they could just submit that and be done, but it doesn't help them any. It doesn't get them ready for the quiz, where it's only on pencil and paper. And so I guess in that regard, I don't really care anymore if you solved it without any help of generative AI, or if you used generative AI to generate a solution, and then you studied it and then carefully analyzed it to the point where, and played with it until you understood it. I don't really care which approach they use, as long as they have feel like they're ready for the quiz and can reproduce those things at quiz time.
Yeah, I certainly that. I think it's very also kind of context and course dependent whether you would consider it cheating. But like, for example, in these intro courses, if you do still have, for example, these programming problems or programming exercises that you're going to expect students to work on, and you, for example, explicitly forbid them from using generative AI, then I think then it's a very clear-cut case of them cheating if they still use it. But I think in some upper-level courses, for example, if we allow them to use it, then obviously then I think it wouldn't be cheating. So I think it's very context and course dependent. But even in introductory courses, you might have exercises where you explicitly allow them to use it, right? Like James said, like maybe you ask them to generate a solution and study that solution and try to understand it. And that might be a thing that they can actually do in the very beginning of the course, for example, when they would have no idea of how to generate the code themselves. So they might still learn from reading the generated code. So I think it's very dependent on the kind of expectations of the teacher and the course, whether you would consider it cheating or not.
Yeah, in an upper level software engineering course, for instance, where your project is thousands and thousands of lines of code, these are students who have they've been in many programming courses. They're often third or fourth year students, at least at my institution. I don't care if they use it, because it's not going to do their whole project for them, right? But if they can use it in constructive ways to help them with, I guess, repetitive things they've written a million times. I've done a million loops. I've done a million database queries. Just help me out to get to the good stuff, the stuff that I am interested in solving, then great. Paul?
Oh, I would only add that for years we've said things to students like, if you cheat, you're only cheating yourself. And I guess that's still true now, right? Which is that If we are wanting them to be able to demonstrate they can do some things without the tools, then they need to make sure they're using them responsibly when they're doing these many small problems, for example, to help them prepare, particularly in our intro level courses. I think what James said is absolutely correct about the upper division courses. But if we're thinking about intro level, you know, we would consider that cheating, definitely. Yes, Rodrigo, to answer your question, if a student copied a problem, pasted it into the model and submitted the solution, we would not consider that to be very valuable for them and their learning.
Okay. There is some sense of we've been there before. Like we've seen all this disruptive technology come and go. Right? There was Google first. We thought that Google would solve everything, and then Stack Overflow. We were like, damn, they will copy everything from Stack Overflow. But you know, this seems to be something different, or is it the same phenomena? How do you feel, you know, like this new technology compared to whatever came before?
Yeah, I was talking about this with another colleague of mine a few weeks ago. Well, actually, when we were working on this study we just finished, and we were talking about these differences. And if I have a programming problem and I search Stack Overflow, and I'm looking through other people's questions and the answers other people gave, I'm going to find probably something that's close to what I want. I know it's not what I asked, and I know they're not responding to me, but you know, it's close enough. I'll find it, copy paste it, edit it. That's fine. What's different, I think, about generative AI is that, you know, when I ask ChatGPT a question, it's responding directly to me and my context. And there's something intoxicating about that, something very enticing that I think I skip over some critical thinking components and just take the things. And I think that it's far more problematic than Google or Stack Overflow and things like that.
Yeah, I think a big difference in a way is that it really lowers the barrier to ask the generative AI for help, for example. So, for example, as an example, GitHub Copilot is free for students to use. It's directly in the IDE. It provides you suggestions even if you don't explicitly ask for them, right? Like if you just write a couple of lines of code, it will give you a suggestion, right? So it kind of is probably more tempting for students to accept those suggestions and take that help from Copilot, because it's directly in the IDE where they're already solving the problem. Whereas going to Stack Overflow, it's more kind of an action that they, you know, take, and they kind of have a little bit more time to consider it. Whereas for Copilot or for ChatGPT, it's kind of there and it's really easy to do compared to, you know, for example, going to Stack Overflow to search for, you know, relevant prior question from people.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it lowers the barrier to getting these sorts of solutions generated, but also lowers the risk. So there was this website, Chegg. I'm not sure if this was very common in Brazil, but it was used by a lot of our students, where they would take their assignment problem, post it to this website, and then they would wait, you know, several hours or maybe a day, and someone would post a solution, and then they would take that solution and submit it as their own. And we, of course, spend a lot of time trying to find and, you know, penalize this sort of behavior. So now the barrier is much lower because they don't have to wait a day. They don't have to pay for the website because you had to pay a subscription for Chegg. But also the risk, because it's just very, very difficult now with these models generating novel solutions. Students can have different solutions as opposed to copying and submitting the same solution maybe that's on Chegg. So a very difficult problem.
Paul, you had a student once, didn't you have a situation where that they had they contracted someone to
help?
Yeah,
I received an email out of the blue once from somebody who said, "Dear Professor Denny, I want to report one of your students who did not do their assignment by themselves. Instead, they paid somebody to do their assignment for them." And of course, I was very curious, who's writing to me? Is it a friend of the student who feels disgruntled that their student is getting some advantage? So I wrote back to them and said, what evidence do you have that the student has not done the work on their own and they've paid someone to do it? And the person responded to me and said, I'm the person that they paid to do their assignment for them. And this really opened my eyes to this whole world of what's called contract cheating blackmail, where, so again, high risk, right? So the student pays somebody to do their work for them. And then when they get the response, now they're blackmailed and they're told, well, if you don't pay me an additional amount, we're going to report you to your university. So yeah, very high risk. And all of that disappears when they can just privately ask one of these models,
At least for now, the models aren't asking you to pay. I'll report you to your teacher.
That's a good point.
That will be an amazing first step on the attack of machines, is to report everyone that was cheating on their assignment from CS intro courses. But let's not get depressed, and let's talk about the benefits for teachers. Like, there are many good ways to use it. Like, can you give some examples on how to make good use for Gen AI for teachers in particular?
Yeah, I mean, one of the good benefits, I think, is that it can really help you create learning materials, for example. So some of the work we've done before is looking into generating new programming exercises using generative AI, and we found that it's at least for these introductory programming course problems that are kind of well defined and kind of small and might be solved with, like, let's say 5 to 10 lines of code. So exactly these small problems that now generative AI can solve, it can also generate those. So in theory, now it would be possible almost to have an infinite pool of exercises for students to practice something, and you can personalize the concept. So you can ask the model to generate an exercise related to some concept that the student is struggling with. You can personalize the theme, so we can actually make the exercise more contextually relevant for the student. So for example, for me, when I was, in my introductory programming course, I would have really enjoyed if all the exercises I did would have been about World of Warcraft, which is a video game I used to play a lot back then. And for Paul, for example, I'm sure he would have enjoyed basketball-related questions. So now we can actually use generative AI to create these personalized exercises that kind of both teach you the concepts that you struggle with and also are kind of directly related to some personal interest, so which probably will help engagement. So I think that's one of the greatest benefits I've seen.
I also think, sort of following on from that, there are some really exciting new pedagogies being explored in computing classrooms that didn't exist before and have only been made possible through the existence of these large language models. So I might get James to describe prompt problems in a second, but I'll explain one particular task that we've been exploring. So you might be familiar with the idea of an explain in plain English problem. So this is where it's really a code comprehension test where you give students a small fragment of code and you ask them to explain that code in their own language, or in English, right? Is typically the way these problems are described. And so here the student has to read the code, understand the purpose of that code. So we're not asking for a line-by-line description, but what is this code trying to do? Now, these are great problems for testing code comprehension, but they've traditionally been very difficult and time-consuming to grade, because if you've got 1,000 students, you've now got 1,000 of these short descriptions you have to grade. So what we've been exploring is giving students one of these code fragments, these explain in plain English code fragments, getting the student to write the high-level purpose statement describing what that code does. But then we give that purpose statement to a large language model to get it to generate code based on that problem statement that the student has provided. And now we can test whether the original code fragment and the new generated code fragment are functionally equivalent. And if they are, we can now give students some objective feedback about how useful their purpose statement was. And this has been going really well. And I think one of the really exciting observations we've made, even in classes here in Auckland, is that students are not always providing these prompts in English. Sometimes they're providing these prompts in their native language. And I think this really opens up lots of possibilities in terms of accessibility of computing education around the world.
Yeah, Paul mentioned prompt problems, which is a related idea that we've been exploring and recently published on. And it provides the student with a visual description of the problem rather than a textual description. And so, for instance, there's a classic problem in chess called 8 queens, where you need to find a way to put 8 queens on the chessboard without any of them being able to directly attack one another. I think there's something like 72 unique solutions to it. And so we just show the chessboard with 8 queens on it. And hopefully the student is able to interpret what it is they're being asked to do, such that they can write a prompt. And so they write this prompt. We send that to a large language model like GPT-4, and it comes back with code. And then you can't edit the code, but you can look at it and then run it against test cases. And if it doesn't pass all the test cases, then the student needs to look at what test case failed, look at the code that failed the test case, and then update their prompt to try and deal with this edge case they hadn't considered before, and then do that in an iterative cycle until it passes all of the test cases. And this helps students deconstruct the problem. It helps them explain it in their own words. They're still thinking about code. They're still reading code, looking at test cases, and solving a problem in an iterative way. But it's not something that's just immediately solvable by just dumping it into a Chat GPT, and still having the students think critically about the programming problem that they're being asked to solve. And Paul mentioned solving these in other languages, and we saw that with the students in Auckland, who some of them were writing in multiple different languages, Maori, Chinese, and still getting prompts. Still getting responses in code. It was cool. And we're running more studies with more languages now, and the results are just spectacular. The students really like playing with it. It's fun, to try and write this prompt and figure out how to generate the code correctly. Our evidence shows that even after they finished, they still want to keep playing with it. Like they solved it, but they're still submitting more prompts, because now they're wondering, well, could I do it in fewer words? Could I do it with could I take a different strategy of description? And that's been really cool to see, building a tool that's not only useful for student learning, but also is just fun to play with.
Yeah, amazing. I'm not depressed anymore. Thanks a lot for being very enlightful for us. Unfortunately, all good things come to an end, and I'll have the last question for us today. So in the 50s, there was this huge quest of replacing artificial programming languages with natural language programming. There are all those papers that in the end, let's wait for the future. Are we in this future? Will Gen AI replace programming? What is your take after almost 3 years studying this topic? And there's many people talking different things. NVIDIA was talking don't teach programming anymore. We're gonna do it for you. What is your take on this topic? Are we going to be replaced or not?
Well, I'll give one initial answer, which is I think actually I'll try and paint an optimistic picture, which I think actually is that solving programming tasks is now something that many more people can do than previously. So I think that actually opens up programming to a much wider range of people. So one, in fact, it's an experience I've had myself where for certain types of problems, if let's say you're not wanting to major in computer science, but you want to write a program to help you solve something, these models can help a lot with that, particularly if you can write a program where in order for you to determine whether or not that program is correct, you really just have to observe the output. So here's a classic example. You've got some big data file, so you've got a whole bunch of data in a text file, and you want to visualize it in a graph, right? So some kind of data visualization problem. One way you could do this, you could write a Python program that uses some, plotting library like matplotlib or something. That's pretty difficult to actually write that program if you don't have a background in programming. But now you can take that data set, maybe you're a biologist or a chemist, or you've collected some other data. Now you want to visualize that data. You can construct a prompt. And I think, what James was talking about around prompt problems is that we do think it's very important to help students learn how to construct effective prompts. That's exactly what prompt problems is doing. So as long as you can construct a prompt to generate the program to produce the visualization, you can then look at that visualization and determine for yourself whether or not it's correct. Are there axes in the right place? Do the actual visualization make sense? So I think here you can imagine lots of other scenarios where people who never previously would have been able to write programs can actually solve programming related problems. And I think that's very exciting.
Yeah, I think Paul touched on this. I think it's more raising the abstraction level, right? So for example, we have a lot fewer, percentage of programmers now writing something like assembly, but we still have some people writing assembly, right? So I could imagine that there is going to be a lot more software written now with the kind of barrier to kind of write software being lowered because of these generative AI models. So I think in the future, it might be that we have these natural language programmers who mostly prompt models, and then probably somewhere down the line, we have someone who's kind of confirming and debugging these large language models written or generated programs. So it might be that, someone who knows Python is going to be somewhere down the line, kind of like now someone who's, doing assembly somewhere down the line in the abstraction level, and we have most people working at the higher level of abstraction.
Yeah, I think we're still going to need people who know how to code because someone has to verify that these inputs are correctly, producing the right outputs and doing that efficiently as well as securely. And so I think we're going to need CS majors and computing professionals well into the future. Like Juho was talking about, I think it broadens the spectrum of who's participating in computing. For instance, my institution, this fall, I'm teaching, this September, I'm teaching a course on, it's introductory programming, but it's for business majors. And so there'll be like management and marketing and finance majors all in a introductory Python course. And I'm going to treat that differently than I do my introductory computer science class, because for these students, they just need to know, like Paul mentioned, how do I visualize this? They just need to know enough to utilize these tools to do the things that the tasks that are common for their discipline that they need to automate. They need a different tool set than I think my CS majors do. So I'm excited to see how that grows over time.
Amazing. So it's time to thank you. It was an amazing chat. I'm pretty sure that the community will immensely enjoy talking to you later as well. It's been an amazing, I think we have a lot of other questions to ask you, but unfortunately we have to stop it here. But again, thanks a lot. I know that it was a big effort for everyone to be at the same time here. EduComp community is really honored to have me with us. Thanks a lot, Paul, James, and Johan.
Thank you, Rodrigo and Mirela, so much for inviting us.
Thanks for having
Thank you so much. Great to be part of the EduComp conference. And you can see it's a bit brighter here in Auckland now, so you've actually been able to enjoy the sunrise with me in Auckland this morning. So thanks for that.
Olá, pessoal. Então, depois da nossa apresentação, nós estamos aqui ao vivo. Gostaria de dar as boas-vindas, né? So I will just translate quickly. So give a warm welcome to Paul Denny, Juho Leinonen, James Prater, and Brett Becker. Brett was unfortunately not able to join us in the previous chat, but he will be here to answer our questions. Everyone, it's a great pleasure to have you here.
Hello.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thanks for the invite.
So I will proceed with some questions. This is how it goes. Some questions are in English. I will translate them nonetheless because Fernando kindly is interpreting them to sign language for our audience. So let's start. So we have quite many questions here. In fact, I will select the first one. That's from Luis Araújo. I will make it in Portuguese and then I translate to you in English. All right? That will be a back and forth quickly. So, o Luis está perguntando, o Luis é do FBA, né? Justamente sobre essa questão, né, da utilização dos LLMs em comparação com as técnicas que a gente tinha para a geração das mensagens de erro, né? E que as técnicas anteriores, como Repeated Error Density ou Recurrent Error Density, ainda não são, se elas ainda são relevantes, né? E como que esses estudos vão evoluir no futuro, ok? So we have one question from Luis Araújo that is from Bahia. He's talking about the error message. You mentioned that they improved it a lot recently. So how the old metrics like we had before, for example, the repeated error density or recurrent error density, how research on these errors based on this feedback from the LLMs will change, and what is the future for error messages now with Gen AI?
I think that's such a great question. We also touched on that in our talk a little bit. I think two things that I'll briefly touch on, and I'm sure it'd be great to hear from the others. In fact, Brett, James, and I, a few years ago, were involved in a large international working group looking at error messages. And at that time, it was well known that error messages were a huge barrier to students. And often they would get stuck with some small syntax error and simply be unable to proceed. And so I think on the one hand, these models can now help generate more understandable and more readable translations of these typically cryptic error messages. So on the one hand, they can just help students understand an error message and what the error is that's generating that message. But on the other hand, I think because these models are so capable of generating syntactically correct code, I think it's likely that as long as students are using the tools responsibly, they're going to be learning programming, but also much less likely to make the kinds of mistakes that lead to these difficult error messages.
Sorry, I will just translate quickly and then we proceed to any one of you that want to add something. So, então, o Paul argumentou, né, de linhas gerais, que conforme essas ferramentas vão evoluindo, né, e os estudantes começam a fazer cada vez menos erros sintáticos, porque as ferramentas estão produzindo melhores códigos também. Não só essas mensagens de erro vão produzir códigos melhores, como elas também vão melhorar a questão de interpretação dos alunos. Então, desde que eles se permaneçam fiéis, né, a esse processo de criação dos programas, ele acredita que não vai ter problema e essas mensagens vão acabar ajudando bastante os alunos. Anyone else want to add something, Johan?
Yeah, I was just going to add that for some concrete numbers, there was a paper at SIGSI recently, just a month ago, from Stanford, from Sierra Wang and Chris Beach, on comparing traditional error messages to GPT-enhanced error messages. And they found that, I'm reading from the abstract here, that students who used the GPT-generated error messages repeat an error 23% less often and resolved an error in 35% less attempts. So there is concrete evidence from a large randomized control trial that GPT-enhanced error messages are more effective for both reducing repeated mistakes and also for correcting mistakes.
Ok, a resposta do ele falou que existem alguns artigos recentes, né, que mostram que o uso do ChatGPT e outros grandes modelos de linguagem, né, eles realmente melhoram a performance dos estudantes, como apresentando essas mensagens mais bem tratadas e que a gente sabe que os LLMs podem gerar para os estudantes. Então, a gente tem evidências concretas que sim, essas mensagens de erro podem sim melhorar o processo de aprendizado dos estudantes, ok? So, the next question is a little bit on like the hook from the end of the presentation about AI replacing humans. And then of course, we spoke a little bit about the new possibilities, and there was one question about replacing teachers. We had like a big controversy here in Brazil, like last week, because one of the governors said that they were generating syllabus with ChatGPT across the state. What do you think about this kind of thing? Are we as teachers in danger of being replaced? How do you see this situation?
Brett, you go ahead and go, and I'll go after you.
Yeah, okay. So, I mean, this is, of course, a question of great gravity given our professions. But all we can do is look at what's happening now. I think trying to speculate is kind of foolhardy. I mean, if we were speculating 2 years ago, we would have been totally wrong, right? So I think speculating is a little dangerous. But if you look at, for instance, the Harvard CS50 course, they're using OpenAI GPT technology to build essentially a personalized virtual TA. They call it the CS50 duck because the duck, quack, quack, is their mascot for that course, apparently. So this virtual TA can, answer unlimited questions for students at any hour of the day. It can answer questions about the course material, but it can also go right up to helping students write and debug code as well. So it's kind of an integrated chatbot IDE tool TA thing. And if we read that road, which is happening right now, I think it's going to become much more common in other institutions. I think that the cost factor is going to be small, I think. And no doubt we're going to see these, products, if you will, coming at us in the next couple of years. And if we have virtual TAs, how big of a step is it to a virtual teacher? And I'm not saying that I don't believe, that there needs to be a human in the loop, so to speak, in the classroom. I certainly do. But I think it's a challenge that we're going to start facing, because if we can have virtual TAs, getting to virtual teacher is not an amazing leap in a lot of ways, at least.
Ok. O Brett mencionou que recentemente, né, tem um curso de Harvard, né, o famoso TS50, que recentemente incorporou um assistente virtual, né, dentro da IDE, do sistema, que ele não só apenas trata do código como o aluno está ali, quando ele pode responder perguntas e etc, né? Então, se já existe esse assistente virtual que tem se mostrado eficaz, o que a gente pode esperar, né, para os próximos anos? Do assistente virtual, que é um monitor para um professor virtual, em termos tecnológicos, que é difícil especular o que a gente vai ter nos próximos anos, é um pulo, né, não tão grande assim. Então, realmente, a gente pensa no que será da nossa profissão, né? James?
Yeah, so I think it's a little stickier than some of this very early work is letting on. Just for instance, the Harvard study, they asked students to self-report what they thought about it, and they all were like, yeah, it was good, it was helpful. But we recently ran a study where we were watching students write code, solving programming problems using AI tools. And many of our students' comments mirrored comments from some of these early studies. I mean, and I say they're early, they're really just published or about to be published even. But I mean early in the sense that they were still early in this time. We don't really know what this is going to look like in a few years, like Brett said. But so, for instance, in the Harvard study that Brett just mentioned, a student said, "It's like it's like I have my own tutor." Or no, he said, "I use this like a personal tutor," which sounds great. And I had a student in my study make the exact same comment, but he didn't use it like a tutor at all. In fact, he just took the answer from ChatGPT, copied it, and pasted it in, and was done. And so I don't think it's as cut and dry as, yes, these tools can generate code solutions. Yes, they can break down code by line by line and explain it to you. That doesn't mean any learning is taking place or happening. So I want to be careful with, I don't think these are going to replace teachers. What I do think is going to happen is that they're going to replace some of the monotony that teachers don't like. Some of the grading, which we've already automated away with automated assessment tools. So some of the grading, some of the answering the same question I get every stinking semester. I think it's going to make some of this, lessen the load, the burden on teachers. Replace them? I don't think so. Sorry, that was kind of long.
Não worries. Então, o James estava falando que, de modo geral, ele não acha que nós vamos ser substituídos, né? Ele deu esse exemplo, assim como o Brett comentou, desses monitores, né, que atuam de forma virtual com os estudantes, os ajudam, mas veja que ele apresentou dois contrastes, né? Um monitor que realmente o ajudou a pessoa a solucionar alguns problemas, atuou de forma construtiva, e outro que simplesmente a pessoa copiou e colou o código, né? E não houve um processo de aprendizado, houve um processo de aprendizado muito pouco significativo. Ele acredita que, de forma geral, esses assistentes vão auxiliar em tarefas repetitivas, como dar notas, né, corrigir alguns trabalhos, etc., mas acredita que seja uma forma mais de suporte do que uma forma de nos substituir, ok? So for the next question is actually, again, there's a link between what we said. I will put the question here because that's in English. I will just translate in Portuguese. Like, do you think that we should change how we teach programming and possibly other computing courses? For example, shift away from syntax and move to how we construct these prompts. Like, I know that you mentioned in your presentation about this new kind of questions you have that are prompts. If you want to elaborate that, like, should we move away from the meaningless syntax? AI will get that. How do we actually move students to this new age of Gen AI in programming?
Yeah, I think there is already, we're seeing some moves towards this way of teaching in a less kind of syntax-focused way. There are, for example, brand new textbooks that have now been written. There's a very nice textbook by Porter and Zingaro looking at using ChatGPT from the very first day of the programming class, and students are using these tools to help them solve programming-related problems. But I think coming back to the question around computational thinking, of course, as teachers in computing courses, we want to develop these computational thinking skills in our students. But at the moment, a lot of the time, students do get buried in the intricacies of syntax. And the idea with things like prompt problems, where students can really focus on crafting prompts, what we've seen from our work on this topic is that in order to solve a prompt problem, that is, in order to create a prompt to solve one of these computational tasks, you really do have to exhibit these computational thinking skills. You do have to understand the problem. You have to decompose it and break it down into small steps and then explain those steps in these natural language prompts. And so I think actually these AI tools are helping to power new types of pedagogies that really get at this idea of computational thinking, which is our ultimate goal.
O Paul colocou que a ideia é que esses novos prompts, a pessoa, para ser capaz de desenvolvê-los, ela tem que entender de alguma forma, né, das etapas do processo de pensamento crítico, da solução de problema. Então, ele enxerga esses novos processos, essas novas pedagogias que a gente vai usar dentro dos cursos de programação, mais como uma forma de transformar o que já existe, né, de novo, né, auxiliando, remover essas barreiras de sintaxe, etc., do que uma forma de substituir o que já temos dentro dos cursos, ok? James, sorry if you want to add something.
Again, thinking back to the study that we literally just ran, what we saw was that we did this study in hopes of finding ways that generative AI could help the underperforming students. But what we saw was that it was actually getting in their way and often replacing critical thinking components from them, such that by the time they got to they couldn't have come up with the answer in the first place. And by the time they got to the answer, they were convinced they had done it themselves and that they understood the problem when they didn't. So I think it could replace computational thinking, which is why I think the kind of work that's being done right now is necessary and urgent. Things like prompt problems and the other work that will come out in the next few years to address this issue is vitally important.
O James colocou que ele vê como essas possibilidades do uso da IA generativa podem sim substituir o pensamento computacional, não no sentido que a máquina está mostrando o pensamento computacional, mas mais no sentido que os alunos acreditam que eles estão solucionando os problemas, né? Eles estão tendo o que a gente chamou na apresentação dessa ilusão de competência, né? Onde eles, seguindo passo a passo, pegando as dicas do sistema, eles estão acreditando que eles estão solucionando o problema e eles estão tendo essa ilusão que eles estão desenvolvendo o pensamento computacional, quando na verdade não é o caso, né? Então essas pesquisas recentes estão investigando tanto como os alunos se comportam, quanto como novas formas de trabalhar o pensamento computacional e a resolução de problemas junto com a IA generativa, elas são bem urgentes e bem interessantes. Tá? So we have a next question. How can Gen AI can be applied to increase creativity in computing projects? You mentioned on your presentation that now we have this power of having like tailored solutions for everyone. And then I will add another question that from our listeners is that, for example, can we worry about being too personalized as well?
So one thing for the first part about creativity, so certainly what we've seen in some courses is that students can brainstorm with ChatGPT, right? So that if they have an idea, they can develop that idea together with ChatGPT. But we actually ran a study recently that's going to be published at the ETC conference in the summer, where we looked at students creating analogies for programs using ChatGPT. And we found that if the students came up with the analogy first, they were more varied. But if they kind of gave the idea or asked for the ideas from ChatGPT, they were less varied. So in a way, if you kind of use generative AI as the originator of these ideas, that might limit the creativity. But then if you kind of, but it can be used productively to kind of help you brainstorm after you come up with some idea, to help you develop your own idea, and that we've seen students do very successfully.
O que o Will colocou é que num artigo recente que eles vão apresentar na ITIX esse ano, eles viram que quando eles pediram para os alunos gerarem as suas próprias analogias, né, elas foram mais diversas e mais criativas do que aquelas geradas após observarem o que foi perguntado para o ChatGPT, né? Então, existe essa consideração que, sim, talvez os alunos possam estar muito influenciados pelo que vem sendo apresentado pelo ChatGPT. Someone else want to add something on creativity?
Yeah, I think that this is a great example of why we need humans in the classroom still, because like Juho said, at least with current technology, and I am fairly confident in saying that I don't think we're going to see true creativity coming out of nowhere from generative AI anytime in the next, let's say, year or two at least. So, you know, there's this risk of this echo chamber. If it's just students talking to bots talking to students with no one keeping an eye on the system and making sure that things are on the right track. These tools currently can be used to spark human creativity for sure. They're great for blank page syndrome if you struggle with, you know, a blinking cursor and a blank page. They can certainly help students who have those sorts of procrastinations get over those procrastinations. But again, this requires some human oversight, at least currently.
O Bright mencionou que ele acha que ainda é muito importante a gente ter esses humanos, né, dentro desse ecossistema da sala de aula, porque ele acredita que a gente não vai ver tão cedo criatividade de verdade vindo desses sistemas de IA generativo, né? E a ideia que é possível criar essas câmaras de eco, né, esses lugares onde os alunos apenas reproduzem o que foi regurgitado pela IA, é um problema e que os alunos realmente precisam desse humano para ter essa diversidade de pensamento e outros aspectos também que não podem ser reproduzidos pela IA. Okay? Our next question is about ethics. So I will just translate first and then I'll ask you. Então, o Gerlason, né, está perguntando como que os sistemas educacionais que usam a IA na educação superior, nas instituições de educação superior, como que a ética, né, os processos éticos dos estudantes vão ser afetados diretamente pelo uso desses sistemas tutores. So, Gerlason is making a question here about ethics and how those systems powered by Gen AI continue to spread out in our universities, and how would that affect first the behavior of students and how they perceive the ethics of using this kind of a system?
I'll provide the obvious answer here, which is that one of the ethical issues that I think we're all grappling with is around academic integrity and the fact that students can now use these tools sometimes to solve problems that we don't want them to solve using these tools. Obviously, there's been a lot of publicity around students solving, assignments and homework problems entirely with tools, and James was touching on this a bit, talking about sort of students overly relying on these tools to generate solutions. And I think this is a problem that we are still grappling with. One solution is to make students very well aware of the sort of rules and policies around ethical AI use for their coursework, but it's a difficult problem, and I don't think we have a great solution for this.
O problema é que a gente ainda não tem uma solução muito clara para esse problema, né? Claro que conforme os estudantes vão usando essas soluções, eles podem desenvolver, né, essa super dependência desses sistemas, né? E que, claro, o nosso trabalho vai ter que ser fazer os alunos ficarem cientes dessas questões éticas, né, de plágio e outras questões dentro das nossas universidades, né, eles entenderem que se trata de uma questão séria no uso dessas tecnologias e também, como foi apresentado no vídeo anterior, né, fazê-los entender que é uma questão de aprendizado, né, não necessariamente apenas de ética.
There's more insidious ethical issues that I think happen when students encounter these models without proper training, which is that these models can only really approximate the things that they've been trained on. And since humans are not great all the time, then obviously we're going to have trained our systems on these massive large language models where you can't clean the entire data set. They'll have things in there that are biased and are bad, and students need to be aware of those things because they could be generating code that is harmful to certain people or reproduces stereotypes or whatnot. And I think that is an existential ethical threat as well.
O James menciona que existe, além desses outros perigos que foram mencionados pelo Paul, né, a questão ética de como esses modelos foram treinados, né, e que tipo de vieses eles foram introduzidos e como que eles continuam a reproduzir com os estudantes, né? Então, se os estudantes são apresentados a esses tipos de soluções apresentados pela IA generativa, eles provavelmente existem pelo menos uma questão de percepção que eles devem estar cientes desses vieses que esses modelos produzem e reproduzem, ok? So I have a round robin question for everyone. Like now we put your teacher hat, and the question is, how have you been using Gen AI in practice in your classroom? Are you actually using something related to Gen AI in classroom, and how you're doing this kind of thing? So I will start with Paul.
Well, I might answer this question because we've obviously talked about things like prompt problems, and I know that in the talk that you played before this Q&A, we talked about explain in plain language problems. And so rather than talking about some of those types of activities, which we certainly are using in the classroom, I just want to share with you what we're actually doing at Auckland in our big intro programming courses. And in fact, I'm really looking forward to learning more about what's happening in the Brazilian context, and I look forward to seeing reports and papers about that. But I can say that actually we aren't doing that much differently other than integrating some of these new types of activities. So the reason I want to emphasize this is that we're still running the same types of tests that we've always run, where students will come into a computer lab and solve problems. The one thing that we have changed is we've changed the weighting of those assessments. So we've moved away from sort of high weights or high number of marks on some of our out of class assignments, so homework problems, where now it's, as we talked about before, it's a little bit harder to know whether students have overused these tools and generating those solutions. And now when we actually bring them into these tests where we have a secure, invigilated environment, we do have a slightly higher weight on those assessments. And there, students have to demonstrate that they've learnt the core concepts, but without the support of these tools. And so I think I just wanted to mention that we are changing what we're doing in some ways, but actually it's also very much business as usual in a lot of our courses.
O Paul menciona que, embora muito tenha continuado semelhante com o que eles vêm sempre fazendo, né, continuam utilizando essas atividades como tarefas de casa, atividades dentro dos cursos, né, eles também têm introduzido mais questões em ambientes controlados, né, testes onde os alunos não têm acesso às ferramentas de IA generativa e outras ferramentas de suporte, até para que eles possam demonstrar com mais clareza essa competência que eles vêm desenvolvendo dentro dos cursos. Mas, de forma geral, tudo parece mais ou menos o mesmo, com a introdução um pouco maior desses ambientes controlados. Juho?
All right, so here in Aalto, so one concrete example what we have used now is that we still have the same course that we always had, this introductory programming course, but we now have, for at the end of different chapters of that online textbook, we have a tool that provides students practically unlimited new questions they can practice. So we are creating these small programming exercises that students can solve to practice skills that they just learned in that chapter, and these exercises are generated with generative AI. So they're totally optional. Students still kind of need to do the original traditional exercises where they're supposed to not use generative AI, but they have this additional practice opportunity at the end of each chapter with these generative AI created exercises. So if they want more practice, they can now go and practice essentially infinitely as long as they want using these generative exercises.
Ok, o que o Ru colocou é que eles também continuam usando, né, os exercícios apresentados anteriormente em cada capítulo e etc. Mas o que eles adicionaram foi uma parte extra dentro do material, onde os estudantes podem praticar de forma infinita, né, quantas questões eles assim desejarem, e dessa forma eles terão mais prática dentro desse material e, de certa forma, explicitamente incorporando essas questões e o uso da IA generativa dentro do material. Okay? Brett?
So thanks to some luck, let's call it, my teaching schedule has been rather easy lately. So I haven't actually had the chance to use this in the classroom yet myself. I have conducted some experiments with students that weren't mine, which was interesting. And that actually goes back to our first question that was on error messages. And I'll just throw in two little bits there. One is when we were talking about how good these tools are at compiler error messages, they need to be given the code context. If you just throw an error message at it, it's pretty terrible, understandably. And the other thing is this particular experiment, which is not yet published, we looked at handwritten, expert-written enhanced error messages versus GPT-4 error messages with the code context and the standard GCC error messages. And the human and GPT are clustered together, and the C compiler is way out compared to the other two. So GPT-4 gives human-like responses to, well, it gives responses similar to human written error messages.
Okay.
But it was interesting watching those students because they weren't mine. And the overarching thread that we've been talking about here is this changing behavior. And I can really say that I really think it is changing the way students approach programming.
O que o Brett colocou é que ele acredita que essas técnicas, né, de IA generativa estão realmente mudando o comportamento dos estudantes. Ele colocou um exemplo que, embora ele não esteja lecionando nesse momento, né, ele tem trabalhado em alguns experimentos com alguns estudantes de outras turmas, onde, por exemplo, eles estão trabalhando com essas questões das mensagens de erro, né? Então, eles compararam 3 tipos de mensagem de erro, uma fornecida pelo padrão, pelo compilador do C, né, o GCC, e outras 2, uma fornecida pelo humano, um expert, né, e outra pelo chat GPT. E no experimento mostra claramente que as mensagens dos humanos e do chat GPT estão agrupadas. Então, os estudantes imaginam que essas questões são muito parecidas ou similares com aquilo que os humanos provêm. E isso, claro, vem mudando o comportamento e como eles usam essas mensagens de erro. James?
This is the first semester I've done anything about it. So it's still an experiment. And if I wasn't going to be one of the program chairs of 60, I'd write up a paper about it, but I can't submit it. So you get to hear about it instead, which is that I'm no longer offering grade for writing code. I still have 35, 40 programming problems in the course, but they're for 0 credit now. And instead, every week I have a 30-minute quiz with multiple programming problems, both read code and write code. And those problems are taken almost exclusively from the homework. So whatever it is, sorting, this week we're doing sorting. And so there's going to be questions with, insertion sort and selection sort and binary search. And so the idea is that if you did the homework problems, you should be able to just sail right through the quizzes very easily. And if you didn't, well, then you're in trouble. And so the writing code is now a way to study for the quiz. And I think it's working out well so far. We'll see what the students say at the end of the semester. And so their grade really is now only these in-class quizzes and their final exam. And that's it. And that's how I'm dealing with the possibility of AI, because the AI can do all of their homework problems for them. And so I'm really agnostic. I don't care how they study. Do they get ChatGPT to generate a solution and then explain it to them? If that works for them, fine. Did they struggle through and write it themselves? Fine. As long as they understand what the code is doing and can, answer those questions on the quiz, that's fine. However they want to prepare for it, it's up to them, right? But I'm hoping that I de-incentivized the incorrect use of AI now, right? Because it doesn't help them if ChatGPT can generate it. So what? I still have to be able to do that in class.
Ok. O que o James está colocando é que ele tem utilizado uma nova abordagem frente aos alunos para desincentivar o uso do chat GPT. A ideia é que os alunos não ganham mais notas, né, pelas atividades extra classe, e realmente encarem elas como uma oportunidade de praticar, porque as questões que vão estar nessas atividades, depois elas vão aparecer tanto na avaliação como nos quizzes, né, de final de aula que ele apresenta para os alunos. Então, dessa forma, ele tirou o componente de nota, né, na esperança de que os alunos, que ele não se importa se os alunos estão usando o chat GPT ou não. A ideia dele é que ele force os alunos a praticarem e que, de alguma forma, os estudantes vejam o benefício dessa prática, porque ele sabe que as questões vão estar nesses instrumentos formativos que vão ser apresentados ao fim da aula ou num teste mais controlado que eles vão ter que desenvolver depois.
Hey, I will add one thing to that, which is most of the students are still completing the programs. Because I can go in and look in the automated assessment tool, and I can see most of them are still doing it. So I think it hasn't deterred them. It's not like they're not doing the work anymore.
So. E ele adicionou que numa experiência que ele está tendo com esses alunos agora, é que mesmo sem esse componente da nota, a maioria dos alunos ainda estão fazendo essas atividades, né? Eles estão completando as atividades desta classe e eles têm mostrado interesse em fazer essas atividades, mesmo sem essa recompensa extrínseca da nota, ok? So next question is a little about a comparative between AI and other techniques. So Wanderson is asking, I will translate first. Então o Anderson está perguntando, né, se a gente usar técnicas de processamento de linguagem natural em PDFs e e-books, né, integrados com chat em plataformas educacionais, pode aumentar o aprendizado dos estudantes? Ele argumenta que, comparado com a IA generativa, essas técnicas podem ser um pouco mais assertivas, um pouco mais precisas. So, in general lines, Anderson is asking, like, if we use natural language processing techniques in books, integrated with ebooks and so on, and chats, how those techniques compare to Gen AI? Can they be more precise? And I will expand the question, what else we have that could compare to Gen AI in terms of effectiveness and efficiency right now? Oh, that's a tough one.
Yeah,
I'll pick it up.
Okay, go ahead. Well, I was just going to say I don't have a great answer, which I think is why there's such a delay in tackling this question. From my own personal position, I'm not an expert in machine learning or natural language processing, which, to be fair, is one of the reasons I've been so excited about these large language models, because now even somebody like myself, who is not an expert, can have access to these state-of-the-art machine learning models that I would certainly not be able to build myself. And so I think, at least from what we've seen recently, the generalizable power of these large language models feels like it's more, or at least equally capable to the more narrow NLP techniques that are very common. However, I'm not an expert in this area, and so I will close by saying I'm just very excited that we can have access as computing educators to these state-of-the-art models.
O Paul colocou aqui, embora ele não seja um expert em machine learning, essas técnicas de processamento de linguagem natural, mas ele acha que justamente essa parte que é excitante nesse momento, que ela proporciona que mesmo pessoas que não sejam capazes, né, tecnicamente, ou não tenham recursos para produzir seus próprios modelos para treinar numa tarefa mais específica, que potencialmente até poderia ser mais precisa, democratizou esse acesso e mais pessoas podem usar esses instrumentos dentro de sala de aula. Do you have a follow-up?
Well, I'll preface by saying that I'm not an expert on NLP, but one thing, for example, that I have seen being published in many of these more NLP and machine learning focused conferences are that large language models are just really almost across all different benchmarks that have existed before, outperforming existing other methods. So I think they're in a different ballpark, so it's hard to compare to prior methods. So for example, something I've seen, for example, is that for generating multiple choice questions automatically, previous methods have really struggled with that. but for large language models, we've seen that they can actually create pretty good multiple choice questions. So it's more that I think large language models are providing many new applications that just weren't possible before because the previous techniques used just weren't capable enough for those applications. So I think that's part of the reason why large language models and generative AI in general is so kind of the topic of discussion right now everywhere, because they have enabled so many new applications that just weren't possible to do before.
Ok, o que o Yu colocou é que ele tem visto alguns artigos recentes, né, comparando a IA generativa com o processamento de linguagem natural, e que a IA generativa tem tido performances melhores do que esses sistemas, e, de novo, ele complementa, né, que mesmo a pessoa que não tem essa expertise, ele pode usar esses sistemas que potencialmente também podem ter uma performance melhor do que a IA que o processamento de linguagem natural, pelo menos nas aplicações que nós temos visto do ponto de vista educacionais. Okay? So, as a follow-up question, we are going back to ethics again. So I will just translate here. I think that touches not only programming, but the computing programs in general. How should we adapt our curriculum to the Gen AI? So, of course, many programs now have a course for AI, but should we be concerned of embedding ethics everywhere? So our students in programming classes and the other advanced courses, they also should be aware of those biases, and actually, how should we do it? I will just translate in a second. Então, eu alterei um pouquinho a questão da Joyce, né? Como a ética e a responsabilidade são inseridos no desenvolvimento e implementação de sistemas artificiais. Eu só alterei um pouquinho para trabalhar essa questão também dentro dos cursos e etc. So, sorry, I will just repeat the question again to be fresh in your head. Joyce is asking two things. The first one is, how should we teach our students about the ethics in AI? And I'm also adding the question, and how should we do it in every single course that we have that Gen AI is now actually involved? How do we change the curriculum so we add those two aspects to our students? We can do a round robin again.
I'll kick it off. So Rodrigo and I were both fortunate enough to be on the steering committee for the CS 2023 curriculum. And what Rodrigo was referring to there about ethics is we made a concerted effort to make ethics unavoidable by embedding ethics knowledge units in every other knowledge area of the curriculum. Largely because when ethical things come up, say something in a machine learning class, it's best if that comes up in the machine learning class rather than in an ethics class on its own, right? I mean, that's better than nothing. But it's best that these issues that arise naturally in a natural context, and students learn from those moments. I think generative AI requires a similar sort of global oversight, if you will. If you're looking at your program, you need to look at who's using it and who's not, and how are they using it. And for those that aren't, why aren't they using it? I've heard of different approaches. Some people think that it should not be used in the first 2 years, and then it should be used in the final 2 years. But the bottom line is we have a great possibility here to have a really, really imbalanced programs. If you don't do any Gen AI in year 1, and then all of a sudden an instructor in year 2 is using it, do they introduce it? Do they talk about the ethics and other things right then and there? Do they even know that their students may not have used it, right? So we really need to talk to our colleagues, and I would be in favor of each department or each program coming up with a plan for this, because otherwise it's just going to be hit and miss, and students are going to lose out ultimately.
Ok, o que o Bright está comentando é que no novo currículo, né, o CS 2023, que já foi lançado recentemente, a ideia é que a ética fosse inescapável, né? Ela é apresentada de forma transversal em todas as disciplinas e ele acredita que a IA generativa deveria ser apresentado de qualquer forma, principalmente para a gente ter um padrão entre os diferentes cursos, né? Às vezes, o seu professor do primeiro ano nunca tocou no assunto, o professor do segundo ano vai usar a IA generativa, será que os alunos foram expostos a isso? Eles sabem dos vieses, dos perigos, dos erros, né, das alucinações que esses sistemas produzem? Algumas pessoas têm defendido um ban temporário, por exemplo, nos 2 primeiros anos e depois usar nos anos seguintes e assim por diante. Ok? James?
Yeah, so I had the pleasure and opportunity to work on the ethics subcommittee for that curriculum. And one of the things, like Brett said, we wanted it to be not just in one ethics class, but sprinkled throughout, put throughout the curriculum. And you may wonder, how could we do ethics in our CS1 course, right? They're just learning about ifs and fors and loops and conditionals and that kind of stuff. And I put a link in there, and thanks for highlighting that. And it's one attempt at having modules, activities in your course, even your introductory programming course, to help students begin thinking about ethical issues. And I think it's not a stretch to incorporate generative AI into some of those assignments as well, and then continue thinking about it and having discussions about it in every class. I think is very important. And I also don't want to lose sight of the fact that I also think having a separate class on it is also good. I don't think it's like one or the other. I think it should be both. And in that ethics class, you can dive a lot deeper into ethical theory, philosophy, and give them some difficult scenarios to grapple with, and make them make claims and argue with each other about these ethical issues facing us. And I think that at least for the next few years, all of my case studies are including something about generative AI in them for this reason.
Uhum. O James argumenta que, no caso dele, que ele participou do desenvolvimento desse capítulo, né, do CS 2023, com relação à ética, ele também favorece uma abordagem transversal, né, onde desde do primeira aula introdutória, onde os alunos estão vendo ifs, loops e etc., essa IA generativa é discutida, mas ele acha que não deveria ser uma abordagem excludente, no sentido que a gente também poderia ter uma aula independente de ética, onde os alunos aprendem sobre a teoria de ética e etc., e como essa ética afeta a IA generativa. Okay? So, we have one question that we discussed during our conversation, and I will slightly change for you. So, in general, how has teachers accepted the use of AI teaching? And of course, you are the experts on the topic, and I would like to know how your departments also have been discussing this kind of thing. So, two perspectives, one from the research in general and your personal perspective and how your department has been discussing. I will just translate quickly. A Maria Fátima Brandão está perguntando, em geral, como os professores têm aceitado o uso dessa IA no ensino. So, who wants to drop in first? How your department has been discussing the use of AI and how research in general has been showing how teachers accept AI.
So I could quickly first say that at Aalto University here in Finland, it has been kind of, to me, surprisingly positive, the kind of reception of generative AI. So, for example, the department actually has its own internal Aalto GPT, which is basically based on GPT-4. And they're basically saying that, well, we should teach students to use generative AI, so it's here to stay. So pretty much they're saying, like, you as the teacher are responsible for how you want to use it and how you should use it, but we as a department are providing you support to using the state-of-the-art generative AI tools if you want to courses. So they've been very supportive. And I think that was also reflected on this interview study that we did with Paul and some others. It was just published at SIGSI, where we actually interviewed teachers last spring. And already then, many of them were saying that, well, it's clearly here to stay, so there's no use in kind of banning it, and it's better to kind of accept that it's here and figure out ways to teach students to use it.
Ok. O Yuri colocou que na Universidade de Alton, onde ele está trabalhando atualmente, né, o departamento criou ferramentas próprias, né, para o uso de IA generativa, e eles oferecem essa possibilidade para que os professores, né, se assim desejarem, podem incorporar essas ferramentas dentro dos cursos dele. Ele também comentou sobre um estudo recente que foi apresentado na SIGSI, né, onde apresenta esse comportamento dos professores, né, de forma geral, eles aceitam que a IA está aí para ficar e que a gente deve incorporá-la de alguma forma dentro dos nossos cursos, né? Brett?
I'm looking for the unmute button. Yeah, so on the research side, we're pretty active across the whole kind of Gen AI ecosystem. There's some gaps, don't get me wrong, but I've been doing all of the education stuff. We have a large AI center at our school that has been looking after like the kind of deep learning fundamentals, if you will. One of our fairly recent graduates actually worked for OpenAI and apparently had some kind of fundamental role to play in some of the latest GPT models. We also have another graduate named Abiba Berhane. I'll put her link into the chat. And she's a leading expert on ethics and fairness and equality in the use of AI. And we even have people, for instance, who are specializing in computational creativity, who are looking at, they used to look at irony and humor and other sentiment kind of analysis of Twitter data and stuff like that, but they've now turned their attention to generative AI and how generative AI behaves when confronted with or asked to produce things like humor or irony. So it's a pretty wide spectrum of research. In terms of teaching, we're still organizing, I have to admit. We are trying to take that whole program view that I discussed, but really we've kind of been caught on the hop here with the November release of GPT-4, and really we're looking at September to roll out some sort of a coherent plan as to when Gen AI is going to be used and how at each stage of our program.
O Brett colocou que na universidade dele, diversos pesquisadores que trabalhavam com outros aspectos, por exemplo, com Twitter, análise de sentimento, etc., eles têm migrado, né, para essa área de pesquisa com IA generativa. Em particular, ele argumenta que como o semestre dele, na verdade, começa em novembro, e eles foram pegos, né, com esse novo lançamento do chat GPT-4, eles ainda estão tentando bolar um plano coerente de como e em que momento essas ferramentas vão ser utilizadas. James?
We're taking it slow. Like I said, this is the first semester that our CS1 course has implemented and integrated Gen AI. So we're waiting to see how that impacts the students who then go into CS2 before we decide how we're going to implement Gen AI, in the next couple of courses in the sequence. However, we have made some changes to our other courses just in the interim, temporary changes. So I know the CS2 course this semester changed the way the prof graded the programs that they're writing. There's less weight on those grades, kind of like what Paul was talking about. They're still doing a lot of similar things, but they've changed the weightings, so that they know that they still have to do the thing in class under supervision. And then we'll see how this goes slowly. I think we're going to, over the next 5 years, we'll probably slowly rebuild our curriculum one class at a time and watching how it goes and then do the next one.
O James colocou que eles estão avaliando lentamente, né, como esse processo vai ocorrer. Talvez eles reestruturem o currículo dele nos próximos 5 anos para entender como que esse processo de uso da IA generativa vai ser incorporado ao currículo, mas ele já mostra que alguns professores dentro do departamento deles estão colocando pesos diferentes nas atividades, porque eles estão cientes, né, de como os estudantes têm usado essas atividades com IA generativa. Okay? So, everyone, unfortunately, our time is mostly over. On behalf of the EduComp organization team, we would like very much to thank you. I know it's very late for you, very early for Paul, and Brett, and James are in the middle of the afternoon, but it was a great pleasure to have you on the previous chat and here today answer our questions. I think our community is pretty happy what we have today. So again, thank you so much. And we are eager to see your research on next few years and where Gen AI will move forward. Thank you a lot.
Thank you very much for having us. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks very much, guys, for being with us, for answering so many questions. It's a very super important for all of us. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And thank you,
Thank
Fernando.
you.
Obrigado, Fernando, obrigado, Fernando, pela interpretação e obrigado à comunidade que nos acompanhou. Continue acompanhando o EduComp.
Pessoal, dando continuidade na nossa transmissão, nós vamos passar agora 2 vídeos referente aos lançamentos de livros, dos 2 livros que nós vamos fazer os lançamentos na quinta-feira. Então, a gente vai passar aqui rapidinho, e depois a gente tem uma etapa de uma outra apresentação cultural também, para poder fazer a transmissão para vocês. nosso segundo.
Olá, pessoal. Venho aqui apresentar o livro MC Teste, Como Criar e Corrigir Exames Parametrizados Automaticamente. Meu nome é Francisco de Assis Piroli, então eu estou lançando esse livro no Simpósio Brasileiro de Educação e Computação, a ser realizado de 22 e 26 de abril de 2024. Esse livro, ele condensa mais de 10 anos de pesquisa na área de avaliação, na área de educação, especificamente na área de avaliação. Ele surgiu por uma necessidade de um curso de especialização no seu processo seletivo. Então, em 2010, houve um processo seletivo com mais de 1.000 candidatos e a gente fez a análise dos currículos dos candidatos. Então, esse processo foi inviável e a gente não conseguiu fazer uma boa seleção. Já a partir de 2012, a gente resolveu implementar a primeira versão do MC Teste em MATLAB e a gente conseguiu corrigir mais de 1.000 candidatos usando esse sisteminha bem rudimentar ainda na época. A gente atualmente já está na versão 5.2 especificamente. Essa versão teve uma colaboração do projeto FAPESP para fazer melhorias e auxiliar nas publicações que estão condensadas nesse site da Vision, com quase 30 publicações direto ou indiretamente relacionadas. Esse sistema ele está implantado na UFABC nesse domínio, mctest.ufabc.edu.br, e esse livro descreve esse sistema a parte do usuário. Tá? Então, são os usuários que utilizam o sistema, então esse livro é destinado aos usuários, para ensinar a usar o sistema. O sistema é de código aberto, está disponível no GitHub, qualquer um pode instalar em sua máquina. Foi feito em Django, tá? Uma API em Python. E esse livro está organizado em 4 partes. Vou mostrar aqui no final do capítulo 1. Então, tem a introdução, a conclusão. A parte 1 ensina a navegar pelo sistema. A parte 2 ensina como criar questões com foco nas questões paramétricas. Eu criei uma playlist no YouTube com 26 vídeos de média de 20 minutos cada vídeo, explicando como criar essas questões. Tem a parte 3, que é como usar essas questões, tanto estáticas quanto paramétricas. E tem a parte 4, que é um resumo dos principais artigos que eu publiquei junto com colaboradores ligado ao MC Teste, tá? E a conclusão. Então, esse livro ele é bem extenso, né? São quase 250 páginas e eu explico detalhadamente como usar o sisteminha, né? E eu destaco mesmo a parte paramétrica que surgiu a partir da versão 4 do MC Teste. Então, a partir da parte paramétrica, a gente conseguiu fazer várias contribuições científicas no processo avaliativo, principalmente no ensino de computação, tá? Que a gente usou nas disciplinas introdutórias de lógica de programação do FABC e também na disciplina de processamento digital de imagem, que a gente teve a felicidade de publicar também nesse simpósio, que foi utilizando também o MC Teste. Então, eu encerro o vídeo aqui, mas eu estou à disposição para esclarecer durante o evento mais detalhes sobre o sistema e também sobre esse livro. Obrigado pela atenção e até já.
E agora, para encerrar, né, esse nosso período de abertura e palestra, vamos trazer uma nova atividade de articulação cultural para fechar. Um abraço, gente. A gente se vê nas outras atividades do evento.